Okay. So let's just reopen our Chumash and have a look at the. Can you just pass me a Chumash also? Sorry, apologies. Thank you. Let's have a quick look at the Psukim that launched the. Hi. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Should I say I don't know if anyone missed the previous share, but it is now up on the Nair YouTube channel. And I would urge, if people weren't here, I don't know if everyone was here last time, to listen to that, because that's when we really went through the Psukim, and it's only when you see the Psukim that you can understand where the halachas that we're going to speak about come from. So this series is fundamentally a halachic series. I was asked to speak about the practical halachas of Tzedaka, and the first year was less practical, but it is important to start from the Psukim. And let's just spend a few moments re-looking at one particular set of Psukim, which is in Devarim Tesvov, Pasuk Zayin and Ches. So let's just get our Chumashim out. Devarim 15, Pasuk 7 and 8. It's page 1016, 1016 in the art scroll. So I just want to we looked at these Psukim in great detail last time, but this time we're just going to look at them very, very briefly. And the pasuk says as follows: if you remember from last time, again, we saw that there's different psukim in the Torah. The Torah speaks about tzedakah in these psukim in Devarim 15, which we're looking at now, and the Torah also speaks about tzedakah in Vayikra 25, and we looked at those psukim. But just let's read one pasuk together, pasuk 7, pasuk Zayin together. When there is a poor person, there's many words in Torah for poverty. Evion refers to, for example, there's an oni. An oni is a poor person, like lechem oni, the bread of affliction. Poor man's bread, matzah. Evion is someone who has a longing. They feel they're missing things. There's lacks. They feel they have a sense of lack. When there is a poor person amongst you, may achad achecha, from one of your brethren, ba'achad she'arecha, in one of your gates, ba'aretzecha, in your land. So we discussed this last week, and this is the source of the idea that in halacha, charity begins at home. That someone who is either biologically closer to one, in other words, a family member, or geographically closer, a member of one's town or city, comes ahead of someone who is further afield. This is the idea that we should give to those close. And this is also the idea that Eretz Yisrael comes ahead of Chutz La'aretz, which is Ba'artzecha, in your land. So Eretz Yisrael comes ahead of Chutz La'aretz, all else being equal. So Ba'achat Shorecha comes first. You should first give to your home city. But then if you're going out of your home city, then Ba'artzecha, give to someone in Eretz Yisrael ahead of someone in Chutz La'aretz. Then it carries on, Lo Sa'amit Eslovavcha, do not harden your heart. Very sick quote says Yodcha, Me'achicha Evian, and don't clench your fist from your brother, the poor person. So we discussed this last time, 2 weeks ago, extensively, and just on a very simple pshat level, the pasuk refers to someone who hardens their heart, in other words, a lack of empathy, or someone who tightens their fist, in other words, a lack of actual giving. So there's two components: there's an empathy and an understanding, and then there's the actual act of giving. So these were the psukim that we looked at in more depth last time. On a practical halachic level, the conclusion from this is that as long as one has money in one's pocket and can afford to do so, you're not going to bankrupt yourself by giving, one is obligated, one should not be turning away a poor person who approaches one for a donation, and this is practical halacha. I began the last year by saying that there's really two areas of halacha. There's maaser, tithing, giving a tenth, and there's tzedakah, charity. The two are not the same sets of halacha. It could be, for example, that you are exempt from maaser because you yourself don't have enough money to tithe. Or it could be I've already given away all my maaser money, so I've got no maaser money left. Nonetheless, I have a chiyuv of tzedakah. I shouldn't turn someone away empty-handed. I don't have to give a big donation. It can even be a few pennies, but I shouldn't turn away someone empty-handed. And this is what we see in the pasuk, that one isn't meant to tighten one's fist. One's not meant to harden one's heart. If someone approaches one for money, one shouldn't say no. And this is an important halacha, that one should never say no to someone who is in need of money. So practical halacha, there's a knock on your door and you open it up and there's someone there fundraising. One should give a donation to that person. However, one is entitled to due diligence. In other words, just because someone is asking for money doesn't mean that they are necessarily in need, and we have a responsibility to allocate our tzedakah money sensibly. And therefore, if there's a possibility that the person is a fraud, one wouldn't give to the person. So one should make due diligence and check that they are genuine to the best of one's ability. There is one exception to this halacha, which is if someone says they literally need to go and buy food. And the reason this is an exception is because there's a risk, if you say no to that person, that they will end up starving, that they will end up being in danger. So if someone says they are literally in need of food, Chazal exempted one from due diligence, and so give the person something, so they can buy a sandwich or a drink or just something very basic. So then just give a massive sum of money to the person, give a pound or two so that they can buy a sandwich for themselves. That's, again, what halacha says. Incidentally, I should mention that if you give money that is fraudulent, you give money to someone who was a faker and didn't need the money, one hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah tzedakah. It's wasted money. It's very sad that the person has conned you, but you've given the money to someone who it's not tzedakah. You've given it to someone who doesn't need tzedakah. If you give someone who has asked for food money, even though it turns out they were taking advantage of you, you have fulfilled the mitzvah tzedakah. And the reason is because society as a whole, Klal Yisrael as a whole, needs us to give money to someone who's saying, I'm starving. So someone says they're starving, how can we say no to them and maybe risk their life? So someone says literally they're starving and therefore there isn't time to do due diligence. So someone says, I need to support my family, I need to pay my rent, I need to get medical fees. There's normally time to sort that out. But when it comes to starvation, Chazal made an exception. And therefore, even if it turns out the person is fraudulent, one has fulfilled the mitzvah tzedakah, because tzedakah means caring for people. And as a whole, people need to be cared for by being given money, even when they are, if they claim that they are starving. So what we've said so far is that as far as Torah law is concerned, one should give something to anyone for whom one has done due diligence, who asks you. It does not need to be a massive sum. We have limitations. One can't necessarily give anything, but a Jew should never tighten your heart. We shouldn't squeeze out our fists. We shouldn't harden our heart, and therefore one should give something, even if it's just a token sum. Number one. Number two, that doesn't exclude due diligence. If the recipient's a joker, if they don't need at all and they're just asking, one doesn't need to give. And number three, the exception to this is if someone is asking for food, and that's an exception is a special takana d'Rabbanan in order to avoid disaster. And therefore, if one does give to someone who's fraudulent, one has been yoked to the mitzvah tzedakah nonetheless in that one case, because there wasn't the possibility of due diligence in that case. So this is the halacha which really derives from this pasuk, that there's a lav not to give someone. Now, this applies where there's someone at the door to whom one has opened. If there's someone who knocks at the door and one doesn't open, you're not mechuyev to open. You don't have to be in the middle of sitting having supper and there's a ring at the doorbell. You don't have an obligation to open if you're busy or something else. If you do open and someone asks you, one should give them. And also just to mention that obviously one has to be conscious of security. So again, halacha is not saying that you have to open up to everyone who knocks at the door if you feel potentially vulnerable or unsafe to do so. What about someone who knocks at the door asking for money and is genuine in the sense that they are genuinely poor, but who asked them to be poor in the first place? And I think we sometimes might experience this idea. Someone knocks at the door and you look at the person and they seem perfectly healthy and they're not. You ask them, are there any medical issues? Aren't any medical issues? But they've chosen a lifestyle in which they need tzedakah, either because of a hashkafic choice, they want to engage in spiritual pursuits and therefore they need the money, or they just, for whatever reason, they just don't seem to be getting a job. And you think, I'm very sorry for you, but go and earn your own living. Go and, if you're not capable of doing anything more sophisticated, go and stack shelves. But why should I give you money for tzedakah? So the Lahavah of Tzedaka speaks about this in his halachic work, which is called Ahavas Chesed, the love of Chesed. And he says that one should still give such a person money. When I speak about due diligence, I'm talking about someone who doesn't need money. For someone who does, even though it's because of foolish choices, nonetheless the person is now stuck and they need money. Now one doesn't have to give large sums because they're making silly choices. They have to have the hassle of raising the funds. And maybe if it doesn't come so easy, they'll rethink their choices and start behaving more sensibly. But unfortunately, there are foolish people in the world, and you can't educate every person. And if someone is making foolish choices or has a temperament such that they're so drawn to laziness that they are disinterested in work, you can't fix the world. People are born and experience all sorts of difficulties. And for whatever reason, this person is in a situation where they have foolishly chosen a life in which they need tzedakah, but the fact is they are now poor. and therefore I ought to give them tzedakah, albeit not massive sums, because I have to allocate my resources widely. But again, one should give a token amount, a token sum to such a person. So in summary, if someone asks for money and they are genuine in the sense that they genuinely need the money, one should give everyone, but it is legitimate just to give a token sum to such people and allocate larger sums to those tzedakahs that one's investigated and is convinced that they will use the money in a better way. But we should never turn away someone who genuinely doesn't have, even though maybe it's their own fault that they've got themselves into that mess. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created some more sensible people and some less sensible people. That's the tragedy of life. Chofetz Chaim phrases it as there are people who are near and poor financially. There's people who are near yadas. They're unfortunately not making reasonable decisions and are engaged in a silly lifestyle. But that's the way it is, and therefore we should still give them tzedakah. So yeah.
What if a charity or corporation that knocks on your door, and the person knocking on your door isn't poor, but they are representing a group of people who are, you still?
A really excellent question. No, you're not obligated because they are not the actual recipients who needs the money. And similarly, an impersonal request doesn't obligate you. So if you get a flyer in the post or an envelope in the post, you're not mechuyev to give tzedakah. But we'll come on to Halachot of Tzedaka later. Obviously, we all have a certain amount of tzedakah funds which we should allocate appropriately, and that may go to a organization, a charitable organization. However, as far as the halacha of just not hardening your heart of giving a token to everyone asks, is only someone who asks you directly. That's the halacha. If you ask directly, you should give. Yeah. Yes. So in general, the halachic sources are not mafurish. I'm not explicit about this. Obviously, if the person needs food now, you'll have to give them food now, but otherwise, nothing specific. I personally feel this is not a halacha, but I think it's more sensible to give the person food, because unfortunately, the reality is that a significant number of people who approach one for food have various addictions and other lifestyle problems, and you may well end up funding their things. So if someone is on the street, a person collecting on the street is very, very sad, a homeless person, if possible, give them buy a sandwich for them rather than giving them money. I should also mention, by the way, that this is only if someone has approached you, just to clarify, if we're talking about homeless people, this is only if someone has approached you to ask for money. If someone is just sitting there and they happen to pass by, again, you're not obligated to give tzedakah. It may be the appropriate thing to do, but it isn't a chiyuv. This idea of not hardening your heart, not clenching your fist, is only when someone approaches you for a charitable donation. So it doesn't refer to institutions or official charity collectors. It doesn't refer, and it doesn't apply to someone who's sitting there and you happen to walk past them. Someone who's made the effort to reach out to you directly, you shouldn't harden your heart. So I do, when I'm able to, if I see someone homeless in the street, I'll buy some food. But I'm busy, I've got other things going on. I can't necessarily always shop to the shop and buy them food. And there's not an obligation to give, especially in cases like this where we're not able to do due diligence, and for all we know, the food will go on the next drug fix or whatever it is. So then one's not obligated to give money in that situation, because A, we can't do due diligence, and B, the halach is someone who approaches you, not someone who you approach them. They're just staying still and giving money. Yeah.
Buying someone a ham sandwich, they're not Jewish, or you can assume that they're not Jewish.
If they're not Jewish, or you assume they're not Jewish, which is the presumption, because of Rove, the majority of residents here, and maybe in Israel is different, but the majority of people here are not Jewish, you can buy non-kosher food for them. There are limitations on business that we're allowed to do with non-kosher foods, but this is not business, it's an act of chesed, and therefore you can buy non-kosher foods. The only restrictions are foods which are also bahana, that we're not allowed to benefit from. Most non-kosher foods we can benefit from, but we can't eat. So the ham sandwich you can benefit from, but you can't eat, therefore you could buy it for the person. There are some non-kosher foods which we're not allowed to benefit from either. Non-kosher wine, for example, but presumably you won't be buying this person non-kosher wine for lots of reasons. Milk and meat combined in a dish under certain circumstances, but generally that doesn't apply to a sandwich that you would buy. And chometz on Pesach, so you couldn't buy a sandwich on Pesach, because again, you're not allowed to own chometz on Pesach. So generally speaking, buying non-kosher foods is okay. You have to use a bit of discretion in order to avoid marasayin and the like, but in principle, yes, you can buy non-kosher foods for someone. Okay, so that's the first halacha of tzedakah, not to harden your heart, not to clench your fist when someone approaches you. There's a second scenario in which halacha in which tzedakah is a requirement, and this is when you have made a commitment to give tzedakah. Now, just a little bit of halachic background. There is a halacha that if we declare commit ourselves with a promise to do something, we have to keep our word. This is the halacha of a neder or a shvua. So if I say I promise to do something, I make a neder that I will do something, one has to do it. There's a second halacha that if one commits to doing a mitzvah, even without using the word neder, one has to keep that commitment. So this is a second halacha of nedarim, of oaths in halacha, or promises in halacha, that for a mitzvah, even if I didn't use the language of neder, I have to do it. Now, normally speaking, this is only when it is verbalized, because in halacha, only something that's verbalized, we think all sorts of things, but passing thoughts pass through our minds. Halacha grants the status of an neder to something which is expressed verbally. And if you look in the language of the Torah again and again, it emphasizes that this is a verbal commitment. So, for example, it says, Lo yachal devori, you shouldn't profane your word. Ishki yafli, a person who expresses, who enunciates a promise. So the Torah again and again limits the obligation of a neder to verbal commitment. So based on this, the Shulchan Aruch says that only if I verbally pledge to give money to tzedakah, am I obligated to keep my commitment? Does it have the status of a neder? So I don't know, you're in a gala dinner, or you hear a very moving appeal, and your heart is moved, and you feel sorry for the cause, and you say, I pledge to give £100 for this cause. That is a neder, and therefore one has to keep one's commitment. One has to give it. The Ramah, who is the halachic authority for Ashkenazi Jews, is of the opinion, the Shulchan Aruch brings two opinions, and the Ramah paskins, that that even tzedakah is unique, that even internal commitments, thought-based commitments, bind one to the commitment to give tzedakah, as long as one has made a firm mental commitment. So if one's mind, one has thought a specific sum for a specific cause, and made that commitment in one's mind, that has the status of a neder, and tzedakah is unique. And this is because tzedakah is referred to in the Torah again and again with the language of nediv leiv, a generosity of heart, a donation of the heart. Do you want to check? I wonder if this is someone who's buzzing from. I was on the subject, we'll leave it. But okay. So this is a nediv leiv, it's a donation of the heart. So just to summarize, one halachic opinion, one opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, is that all nedarim are only when they are verbalized. Otherwise, it does not have the status of a pledge, a promise that must be kept. The Ramah, and one opinion in the Shulchan Aruch, is that uniquely, even a thought-based pledge binds one with tzedakah, as long as, and on condition, that it is a genuine specific commitment. So if, I don't know, you're getting irritated that you're waiting for the bus, or you're going through a tough time, and you think, oh, I'm really going to give tzedakah, that's not what we're talking about. There's a passing thought. There wasn't a specific intention of a specific sum to a specific tzedakah. But if you did think of a specific sum to a specific tzedakah, then you are bound by that commitment and has the status of a neder. If you're Ashkenazi, that is the final halacha. If you're Sfardi, then you should consult a Rav, because there's different approaches in as to how to pass between the two views in the Shulchan Aruch. But this is the halacha of a neder for tzedakah, and it's a very important one to be aware of, because again, sometimes we attend appeals, or you hear about a particular case, and you think, oh, that's terrible, that's really bad. If you just think that's terrible or really bad, I ought to give something, meaningless. If you actually have specified a particular amount in your mind and a commitment to give to a specific tzedakah, then that is a chiyuv. A while back, someone told me that they got one of these charity appeals, which we now, Baruch Hashem, get endlessly, and that's wonderful. Become Israel, commitment to tzedakah. And a friend sent them an appeal, and they thought, oh, I really should give something to my friend. That's not a commitment on halacha. But then they said the following: they logged onto the charity site and they entered the sum that they were going to give, and they pressed enter, and then they lost internet connection. In the meantime, by the time they got back on, time had passed, and the initial sort of impulse to give money had passed, and they wanted to give something less. So I think in that case that would be included in Nidrei Tzedaka, because they had thought of a specific sum to a specific tzedakah. It's true that they hadn't managed to do it because their internet crashed, but they had entered the figures. They had decided to give a specific sum. So I think that would be a modern example of where the halacha of Nidrei Tzedaka would apply. They've made a neder, they've made a pledge, what would count on the halacha as a promise, and therefore they wouldn't be allowed to break their promise. So this is another example of the commitment in halacha, that a case where one's obligated to give tzedakah. Other things. Sorry, any questions? Yeah.
So if people come up to you on the tube, which I've noticed here a lot,
yes.
And then people come up to you in the street on the tube, and people come up to me all the time, to everyone. So do you have to have cash on you? Do you have to have like an Apple TV? Like, are you required to hold it?
No, you're not. If you have no money, you have no money, so you're exempt. If you have money on you, you should give something. So yeah, so you should give something, even again, it doesn't have to be a massive sum, but a token amount one should give. Yeah.
And so people then say, oh, but there's a cash machine over there. And
That you're not motivated to that, you don't just go to the cash machine. Yeah. And I should point out also there's a safety element, by the way, to all of this. Also, one does have to be conscious of that. Also, I wouldn't go to a cash machine with someone hovering over me. I mean, no, if it's a genuine cause, of course I would. But at the end of the day, you don't know much about this person. You are not able to do due diligence. As I said, if they're just sitting there and they don't approach you, you're definitely exempt. If they do approach you, then there is a chiyuv. But one has to think a little bit about due diligence. But the presumption is that someone's approaching that they're genuinely in need, even though they're probably foolish that they got themselves into that situation. So often there's a lot of questions to be asked about this person, their lifestyle, and maybe addictions have developed. But the fact is, tragically, they've got themselves into that situation. Now they need food, and therefore they need things one has to help. Yeah.
similar to that, but I've had it like on the tube, like you've seen there.
Yeah.
And then someone comes up and hands a note, it's like
Yes.
there's a note next.
Yes.
Right. So they're not verbally asking you, but on that note it says like my name's Sarah,
Yeah.
so I have a 3-year-old child.
Yeah.
Is
That's also a request for tzedakah, and you're obligated to give. Yeah. In fact, let me just take a few moments just to talk about this. So who, I'll add. I'll come into a few moments actually who are legitimate recipients of tzedakah in more detail, like who's considered a legitimate recipient. Let me just finish off who's obligated to give tzedakah, and then we'll look at recipients just to keep order. But I'll add some more details to your question. So the first halacha is every Jewish person is hired to give tzedakah. That's what we saw the psukim, this pasuk, and the other psukim in Vayikra that we looked at in the last year 2 weeks ago. Interestingly, even an oni is a poor person is themselves obligated to give tzedakah. So I can't emphasize this enough. Hilchos Maaser, the halach of tithing, is different to Hilchos Tzedaka. They're not identical halachas. There's Hilchos Tzedaka of giving to charity, and there's the halachas of Maaser of tithing. They're not the same halachas. A poor person is not obligated to tithe. They're not obligated to take Maaser, but they're still obligated in tzedakah. No Jew should be in a situation where they're not giving tzedakah. And therefore, even someone who's poor and is the recipient themselves of tzedakah should give token sums to tzedakah. You're not entitled to take tzedakah, to receive tzedakah and give large sums to tzedakah. What entitles you to take money and give to others? But a small quantity, 10 pence to someone who asks you, one is obligated to give. We're not allowed to harden our hearts. To be a Jew is to someone who doesn't harden their heart. So everyone is obligated to give tzedakah. And the Shulchan Aruch and the postscript even speak about a situation where effectively one poor person is funding the other one and they're funding each other. Yeah, that's the way life is. You can't make a deal, I'll give you 10 pence and you'll give me 10 pence, because that's not tzedakah, that's just exchanging money. But a poor person can fund another poor person, and it may be that they choose also to fund you, but people should not, every person should have should give some money to tzedakah. That is a chiv if you have money on you, if you have money available. Children should be educated to give tzedakah as chinuch. In fact, one of the prime psukim that we have around tzedakah and chinuch links the two. And this is a pasuk that we read just in last week's Seder, and again we looked at it in the previous year, in which Hashem says, I'm going to inform Avram about the destruction of Sodom. We just read it last week. Because Avram is something special. How does Hashem express that Avram is something special? He says, Ki yodativ, because I know him, I know Avram. Lemana sheyetzav es bonov achov, Vesbeis achov. I know that he commands his children after him to do what? Last is tzedakah mishpat, to do mishpat, which is justice, and tzedakah, which is charity. So Hashem says to Avram, Hashem says about Avram, the reason why I consider him special is because he's instructing his family to mishpat, to be honest, to keep in line with justice, but also to give tzedakah. So tzedakah is in a way one of the few examples that the Torah explicitly talks about the idea of chinuch, that we're meant to raise our children to also give tzedakah. That's in terms of children giving tzedakah. The poskim are not massive fans of children collecting tzedakah. And you should be aware of this. I don't like the trend. Sometimes you see kids, little kids collecting tzedakah. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's wonderful that they're trying to raise money for organizations. On the other hand, we don't want to train people to be takers in life, and it needs a little bit of kind of thought about the balance to be found in terms of children collecting and raising money for tzedakah. If they're doing something and they're working hard to raise it, like a sponsored walk or something, the HKMS does a sponsored walk, I don't think that's training a child to be a taker. In the contrary, like we're teaching them, you're really working hard. If it's just going around with the pots in hand, I think there's a bit of a double-edged sword around the concept of training children to takers. Rav Shlomo Zalman speaks about this, and others. They weren't big fans of the idea of children being tzedakah collectors. It trains one ought to feel a certain discomfort with having to ask people for money. We shouldn't be takers in life, we should want to be givers. Therefore, they weren't massive fans of it. Incidentally, if I'm talking about children, I'll add in that if someone is fundraising, they have to be careful not to accept a large sum from a child, because there is a presumption that the child does not have authority to give away large sums of money. And therefore, again, part of due diligence of a fundraiser is to check that they are getting honest money. And therefore, a child can give a token sum from their pocket money. If you're getting a sum that that appears to too large for the child, one should not accept that money. And similarly, one should not accept money that, or at least should ask a shaila about, I'm not going to go through all the scenarios, about accepting money from a non-kosher source. By non-kosher, I don't mean that it's pig meat. I mean a source that isn't ethical and honest. There's many scenarios where money comes from inappropriate sources, and again, each person needs to ask a shaila in an appropriate case. Many years ago, there was a large Jewish millionaire, or perhaps even billionaire, I don't know, Jewish millionaire, who made his profit from forms of media that involved highly inappropriate content and immodest content. And he went round several institutions trying to offer large donations, and they all refused the donation. It's not appropriate to take money from people that are spreading inappropriate material and earning money from that. In the end, one particular institution group took the money and used it to build a shul. And I'm delighted to say that the shul has never been successful, and it doesn't deserve to be successful. There are things that there are sources that we should not take money from. It's not appropriate to take money. We have to have standards, and again, I appreciate there's grey areas in this, and each case needs to be asked an independent shaila. But in principle, it's just something one should be conscious of. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said so far, every person is obligated in tzedaka. Children should get chinuch to give tzedaka. And since we were talking about children, I mentioned that the poskim are not massive fans of children collecting money, and also raise awareness that if you're collecting for tzedaka, you need to be conscious about the kashrus of the source you're receiving from, whether adults from inappropriate ways of earning money, and from children if it's sums which aren't realistic for a child to give. It may be they do not have parental consent to give that sum, and therefore one needs to be careful that one's receiving the money from a kosher source. Any thoughts or questions around that before I go on? Okay, so that's the halachas of giving out money. Let me then just address a couple of points in terms of who we give tzedakah to. So I mentioned already that one should due diligence. If you give money to someone who is not an oni, not a poor person, one has not fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah. It may be chesed. It's nice to give people gifts, but it's not tzedakah. Tzedakah is to someone who needs, and in a few moments we'll define what we mean by needs. One should, as I said, use diligence, other than in a case where someone is asking for food. Now, I should mention at this point, because you're asking about people collecting on the trains or the like, is the mitzvah of tzedakah to Jews or also to non-Jews? So the pasuk, when it describes tzedakah, says when there is a poor person from your brethren, which is normally translated to mean from within the Jewish people. And this is indeed the case, that part of the halacha of tzedakah, family charity beginning at home, is that we build circles of closeness, and therefore, in the same way as if one has a relative who is poor, one would give them ahead of someone who is not a relative. Similarly, one would give tzedakah to a Jewish cause ahead of a non-Jewish cause, because it's me'achat v'chacha, it's from one's brethren. Having said that, there is a mitzvah of tzedakah to anyone who needs it, and the basis of this mitzvah is the concept called darkei shalom, ways of peace, which means we're all human beings, and we all should appreciate shleimus and harmony and togetherness between all of us, and every human being deserves the respect of darkei shalom, of a peaceful and respectful treatment, and therefore one absolutely should, in practical halacha, give tzedakah to a non-Jewish needy case also. However, it is legitimate to say that we prioritize those who are closer to home in the same way as we prioritize family. We see the whole of Klal Yisrael as a single family. So the chiyuv and the mitzvah tzedakah applies to Jews because of the pasuk of Ki Yebecha Evyon, applies to non-Jews because of the concept of Darkei Shalom, that everyone should be treated in ways of Shalom. Nonetheless, all else being equal, if one has only one sum of money and has to make a decision on how to allocate it, we prioritize to Jewish causes. But most of the time, we don't have one sum of money. Baruch Hashem, we live in a time of plenty, and we may have several sums of money, in which case, Mishum Darkei Shalom, we would give to non-Jews also. So that's in terms of that answer. That I wanted to mention that when you asked about people collecting on the train, one should give to such people, assuming that we know that they are genuine. And similarly, Baruch Hashem, the community has been very active in raising money for the tragedy going on in Ukraine and the like, and that's wholly appropriate. That's what it means to be part of Klal Yisrael, that we should feel V'rachamav al kol ma'asav, the pasuk says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has mercy on all humans, and chas v'shalom to think that this is limited only to our people. So yeah. Yes. So, because of the family connection and hakaras hatov and appreciation, that would then again be a factor in prioritizing, but that would need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis also. So it's probably a more direct conversation. But in principle, even though there is the concept that maybe I'll just speak about this for a few moments. There is a concept of, for example, in the process of Geirus and the like, the idea that a ger is kakotan shenolad, is like a newly born child, and therefore ceases to have direct family relation with relatives previously. Unfortunately, this concept is often misunderstood or misquoted to be taken to mean that there's a limitation on contact or the like, and that's not the case. The prerogative of hakaras hatov, of appreciation for those that one loves and those who are close, still applies. It's simply a halachic formulation, explaining that the halachas, for example, of forbidden marriages and the like, don't apply in this case. But it does not mean that there isn't similar family link which is there. Nonetheless, achicha, this concept of the Jewish family, would not apply in this case. So we need to be balanced between the two. Okay, so this is the idea of who one gives to. As I mentioned, money given to an oshir, to a wealthy person, is not tzedakah. It's a gift. It may be very nice, it may be chesed, it may be appreciative, but that's not tzedakah. Okay, so what defines a poor person? So it certainly is a case where someone literally now currently doesn't have enough to sustain themselves. It also applies to someone who is earning money that is enough in principle to sustain themselves, but they are burdened by debts such that they are using such a significant part of their income that the remaining money is not enough for them to live. And it also applies to someone who does not have steady income with reasonable expectation of income, such that they don't have enough, that they reasonably cannot expect to earn enough money over the course of the next 12 months. So if someone has a steady income, they are not, which is sufficient to sustain them, they are not an oni, they are not a poor person in halacha, and should not be a recipient of tzedakah, even though who knows what will happen, they may lose their job or the like. If someone is working on a freelance or consultancy basis, but the reasonable assumption of the nature of the industry they're involved in is that they will have sufficient to get them through and earn enough to keep going over a stable period of time, which halacha defines as 12 months, again, they are not an oni and shouldn't take money. If the person happens to have money in their pocket now, but there isn't a reasonable expectation that they will be able to have money next month, then they are entitled to take tzedakah money now, even though at this point in time they have enough. They're allowed to receive a donation that's being offered to them. So that's the balance of what we define as an oni. Similarly, someone who has a stable income, which is enough for regular needs, but there's a one-off expense or series of expenses that push them below the ability to sustain themselves. For example, a sudden health emergency that occurs, or the like. Then again, they are entitled to receive tzedakah. So just to summarize, someone who obviously has no money now, that's definitely an oni, no money for basic living expenses. Someone who has an income which generally is enough, but for some specific reason it's not enough at the moment because of debts or because of one-off expenses, then again, this is a person who's an oni, and someone who does not have a stable source of income, and therefore it's reasonable to expect that within the next 12 months they will run out of money, is allowed to take a gift or tzedakah that's offered to them now, even though at this moment in time they have enough and they have money in their pockets. What defines an oni? What standard of living is called an oni. When I say they don't have enough, what does that mean? They don't have enough. I mean, what happens if someone can afford bread and water? An oni means what's considered a reasonable standard of living in the context of the society within which they operate. So I understand that this is somewhat wishy-washy and sometimes hard to determine, but what would be defined as an oni in Northwest London in 2022 might be very different to what's been defined as an oni in Poland in 1822. It would vary on the time, and in order to live a reasonable life without undue stress and without without strain and without effect on well-being and the like, you can't expect someone to live in a hovel eating potatoes and water, even though maybe 200 years ago all our ancestors were living like that, and that would have been a perfectly reasonable way to live. Times vary, and therefore it means what's considered a normal, reasonable standard of life. So someone should not be accepting tzedakah money in order to fund an expansive lifestyle. If it's talking about basic accommodation in a reasonable house where their children can sleep in reasonable comfort, and I would even say the ability to take a short holiday every so often, expansive holiday or traveling abroad, the ability to take a few days off occasionally, that would be considered an oni in Halachah if someone comes for that. Because the reality of life in Northwest London is that someone can never take a break or never get away, that would be considered onious. If all their children need to be packed into very unto you tight living conditions, that would be called onious. So it's difficult to determine, and I appreciate it's a little wishy-washy, but one has to try and use a judgment call in the circumstances of each era and each time and space in life. That was what would define an oni. Similarly, an oni would also include someone who is wealthy but happens to have liquidity problems and doesn't have cash at this moment in time. So someone is wealthy, but for whatever reason, at this point in time, they are unable to get access to their money. Maybe an oligarch, his bank account has been frozen, or a less dramatic situation where, for whatever reason, someone owns a large amount of properties, but for whatever reason, they invested foolishly, they don't have a penny in their bank account, and until they're able to free up the properties and sell them, it will take a little bit of time, and maybe even they wish to avoid what's called a fire sale, selling something in a rush at a significant loss, then again, such a person would count as an oni. So we're not just looking at the capital someone has, we're looking at whether at this moment in time, they don't have, they're not able to get liquidity, they're not able to get hold of cash, and that would count as an oni. And as far as strict halacha is concerned, even once they get back access to their cash, they do not have to refund the tzedakah money, because at the time they received it, they were legitimate recipients. So let's say someone doesn't know cash, but they own properties, but it takes time. It's going to take them 3 weeks to sell the property. They're finally able after 3 weeks to sell the property, and they get £1 million. So now they're wealthy again. But in the 3 weeks, they had to feed their family, and they received £1,000 a week, whatever it was that they needed. They do not have to refund the money that they spent because they weren't oni, they were a legitimate recipient then. Nonetheless, the post can say that it would be an appropriate midas chasidus, an act of appropriate chasidut of piety and sensitivity, to refund the money to tzedakah, since at the end of the day they had the resources, they just couldn't access it. So someone who is genuinely poor and later becomes richer does not have to refund the money to tzedakah. For someone who was rich all along but was just short of liquidity, it should refund the money in the meantime. So that's the halacha of recipients of money. And again, I will just simply add that we need to do due diligence when you receive a donation. So all of us, and we'll speak about this later, has responsibility to allocate money to tzedakah in a sensible way. And that does involve it. It's an achayis responsibility. Baruch Hashem, Hashem has gifted us with relative wealth. All of us sitting in this room have relative wealth, and we therefore have responsibility to use our money wisely. And part of the responsibility to use money wisely is to make sure that we work on ensuring that the tzedakahs we're giving to are appropriate. And therefore, even though I think you asked about organizations approaching, there isn't an obligation to give on the spot because it's not an individual person asking me. Nonetheless, they may be the better recipient for larger donations, because if I trust the organization, I know that they're going to allocate money sensibly and appropriately. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so this is a summary of the halachas of recipients and checking that they are appropriate recipients. I should say, by the way, even due diligence has limitations. You don't have to do it the whole time. If someone you know is generally a poor person and they have a reputation as being an honest person, you don't have to check the whole time whether they're needy and humiliate them by going constantly to their accounts. But you can say that as long as in general they're seen as a reputable person, that's enough. Maybe I'll just use the last couple of minutes available, unless there are any comments, just to speak briefly about the order of priorities of giving tzedakah. And I want to emphasize that even though halacha talks about, and next week maybe we'll look in more. Next week, by the way, there's no show. I'm away next week. The next show will be 2 weeks' time. I apologize for this. So in 2 weeks' time, I'll look in detail about how we should prioritize our money. So what I will try and do in 2 weeks' time is actually go through on a practical level how to prioritize giving, and then the week after that, I would like to go through on a practical level how to work out whether we are obligated in Maaser and how to do Maaser calculations. For now, I'll say as follows. The halacha does talk about orders of priorities. I should emphasize, though, this is not absolutely set in stone. And therefore, even though there are priorities, one also has to be true to oneself and what one particularly is moved by. All of us have particular tzedakahs that speak to us for particular reasons. And even though the order of prioritization is giving us a general sense of how things should prioritize, it's not set in stone and mandated that you absolutely have to follow this for many technical reasons. Basically speaking, I'll use the few minutes available now to talk about the nature of the need, and the next time we'll speak about who it is that's asking. So in terms of who it is who's asking, we spoke about family coming first, and about people that live near you, about people that live further away. That's about the people involved. But let's now just look at the need. Basically, someone who needs food comes ahead of someone who needs clothing, and as I said, that comes ahead. When someone asks for food, we do not do due diligence. But when someone comes for clothing, food that comes ahead of clothing. The next need is accommodation. So once someone has food and once someone has clothing, the next priority is accommodation. And after that would come other needs, even though, as I said, someone is an oni if they don't have them. So obviously, even though I said someone is entitled to receive tzedakah if they can't have a basic standard of living that's appropriate in Northwest London in 2022, nonetheless, as a priority, they would clearly become behind someone who genuinely doesn't have. So someone who's living in very cramped conditions and it's painfully difficult for their children, they are legitimate recipients of tzedakah. But clearly their needs, nonetheless, would come after someone who literally has no roof over their head. And if someone is in very cramped conditions, they would come ahead of the person who can't take a few days break, even though someone who can't afford a few days break, that is an anias, and you're entitled to take tzedakah to get a short holiday because that's necessary for well-being in today's day and age. Nonetheless, the person who needs the short holiday clearly comes after the person who's living in tight conditions. So for now, that's what I'll mention about order of priorities, which is food is the most basic, then clothing, then accommodation, and then the extras, even though these extras are things that entitle someone to be considered as an oni, as a poor person. And with that, we'll stop for today. Anyway, it's a shame next week speak in more detail about 2 weeks' time, speak about more priorities. Any thoughts or questions about anything we discussed? Okay. For those who missed the last show, I would urge you to listen to online because that's we looked at the psukim and saw how all these halachas emerge from the psukim. I'm also open to feedback because I'm conscious that this is quite dry. I'm sort of just going through dry halacha, but that's what I was asked to do. So that's what I'm doing in this case. But if people want, when we finish the halacha, I'm open to feedback. If people want to do more. There's always a balance between dry halacha and machshava and philosophy and asha and other things. So I'm open to feedback about that. Good. I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you so much for joining. It was honored that you attend. Thank you.